The fire escape on Chain Street smelled like rust and engine exhaust, and something older underneath something that lived in the metal itself, baked in by decades of Detroit summers. Caden Ross sat on the top step with his back against the railing, and his eyes closed and his hands loose in his lap, and he listened. 3 floors below, a 1987 Buick LeSabre idled at the curb. Mrs. Peterman's car. She ran it every night for 15 minutes before bed, some habit from a colder decade, when engines needed warming before sleep. The idle was rough tonight, rougher than last week. Caden could hear the miss in it, a slight stumble every 2 seconds, a small hesitation in the rhythm, like a man with a limp trying to walk steady. Cylinder 2, ignition coil breaking down under heat load. The coil was probably 3 years old, maybe 4. It worked fine when the engine was cold. Started breaking down around the 8-minute mark when heat built up in the secondary winding. Classic failure pattern on the 3800 series engine. He'd heard it a dozen times in his father's garage. He opened his eyes, pulled a small notebook from his back pocket and wrote it down. The date, the symptom, his diagnosis. He'd been doing this for 2 years, filling notebooks with engines he'd never touch, problems he'd never be paid to solve. It was the only way he knew to keep the ear sharp. Use it or lose it. His father had said that. His father had said a lot of things that turned out to be true. He put the notebook away and looked out over the rooftops. Detroit spread out below him in layers of orange streetlight and shadow. Somewhere out past Woodward Avenue, a truck downshifted on the freeway, the exhaust note dropping a full step as it slowed. Caden heard the turbo flutter on the compression release, heard the slight rattle in the intercooler pipe, heard the whole mechanical story of a driver braking too late and downshifting too hard on an engine that had seen better days. He heard everything. He just couldn't do anything about most of it. His shoes were splitting at the outer sole on the left foot. He'd wrapped electrical tape around the toe box 3 weeks ago, and the tape was starting to peel. His shirt had a bleach stain on the collar from the car wash chemical spray, a permanent ghost of a Tuesday afternoon on Livernois Avenue. He had $11 in his front pocket and a bus pass that expired in 4 days, and a library book in his backpack that was due back Thursday. The book was called Fundamentals of Internal Combustion Engines. 3rd edition. He'd read it twice already. There were notes in the margins in his handwriting, small corrections and additions, places where the text didn't match what he'd learned in the garage on Gratiot Avenue, from a man who knew more about engines than most people knew about anything. That garage was locked now, had been locked for 2 years. He'd stood on the sidewalk the morning the county came and watched a stranger put a padlock on the door of the only place he'd ever felt entirely himself. Back taxes, 3 years of them. His grandmother Loretta couldn't keep up on a fixed income, and a grief she wore like extra weight. The county didn't care about grief. The county sent a man in a county shirt who didn't look Caden in the eye once. Not when he arrived, not when he hung the lock, not when he drove away. Caden had taken the toolbox, that was all. Everything else stayed inside. The pegboard with his father's tools arranged in the exact order Ray Ross had decided on sometime in the late 1980s and never changed. The overturned bucket Caden had sat on since he was old enough to sit still. The smell of motor oil and steel shavings, and something else, something human and specific that lived in that building and nowhere else on earth. He took the toolbox, wrapped everything in an old bedsheet and stuffed it into a backpack that barely zipped. Carried it home on the bus. That was 2 years ago. He was 16 then. He was 18 now. The toolbox sat under his bed in the apartment on Chain Street. He opened it sometimes just to look at the tools, each one in its place, the same arrangement his father kept. The half-inch Craftsman wrench with the chip on the jaw sitting on the center hook. Center hook. Always. Ray Ross had a reason for every placement. And even though Caden couldn't always remember the reason, he remembered the placement, because the placement was part of the lesson, even when the lesson wasn't obvious. He went inside when the Buick downstairs finally shut off. The apartment was quiet. Loretta was asleep in her room with the television on low, the way she always slept, needing the sound of voices even in unconsciousness. He checked that her door was closed, checked that the stove burners were all off, checked the front door lock. Then he sat on the edge of his bed and pulled the toolbox out and opened it and looked at everything inside for a while. Then he closed it, set his alarm for 4:45, and lay down still dressed because it was already past midnight and the car wash shift started at 6, and he needed the hour before that to get there on the bus. He was asleep in under 3 minutes. He dreamed about nothing. Men who work that hard rarely dream. Ray Ross had come to Detroit from eastern Kentucky when he was 19 years old with a bus ticket and a box of hand tools and a mechanical instinct so precise it bordered on something supernatural. He didn't talk about Kentucky much. He didn't talk about his family there. He talked about engines the way other men talked about people, with interest and affection and occasional exasperation, as if the machines had personalities worth understanding. He set up the garage on Gratiot Avenue when Caden's mother was still around. She left when Caden was 4. Ray never explained it, and Caden never pushed. What he understood was that she was gone, and Ray was there, and the garage was always open, and that was the life they had. It wasn't a bad life. It was a life full of engines and the smell of oil and the specific satisfaction of broken things made to work again. Ray had a reputation that traveled by word of mouth through every neighborhood east of Woodward. People brought him things nobody else would touch. A 1965 Mustang with a seized engine that 3 shops had declared dead. Ray had it running in 2 days. A marine outboard motor that hadn't turned over in 6 years. Ray rebuilt it on a Saturday afternoon while Caden sat on the overturned bucket watching his father's hands. Those hands, wide across the knuckles, stained permanently in the creases with oil that no soap fully reached, moving over engine components with a confidence that wasn't rushed and wasn't slow. Just exactly right, the exact pace the work required. Caden was 9 the first time Ray put a wrench in his hand. They were standing over a 4-cylinder engine block pulled from a junked Chevette. Ray had set it on the workbench and was preparing to walk Caden through the valve train. He handed over the 1/2-inch Craftsman, the one with the chip on the jaw, and Caden wrapped his fingers around it and started to position it on the rocker arm bolt. Ray put his hand over Caden's and stopped him. "Don't just grab it. Feel the bolt first. Let the metal talk to you." Caden didn't understand. He was 9. He just liked being there. He liked the smell and the sound of his father humming while he worked, and the way the afternoon light came through the single window above the workbench and turned the oil on the floor into something that looked almost beautiful. But he held still and he felt the bolt, and he tried to understand what the metal was saying, and slowly over months and then years he began to hear it. By 10 he could name every component of a 4-stroke engine blindfolded. Ray would pull a part from a junkyard pile and hold it behind his back, and Caden would identify it by touch alone. Connecting rod, piston ring, rocker arm, valve spring, every time. Ray would move the test along the shelf of difficulty, pulling increasingly obscure components. Primary chain tensioners and cam-bearing shells and exhaust valve guides. And Caden identified them all by the shape under his fingers and what that shape meant in the context of a running engine. By 11, Caden started hearing things, not voices, not music, layers inside running engines that most people experienced as a single wall of mechanical noise. Caden heard instruments. The intake valves had a pitch, the exhaust had a rhythm, the timing chain had a tempo, and when something was wrong, even slightly wrong, even wrong by the smallest margin that produced no symptom yet. Caden heard it the way a man who has spent his life in an orchestra hall hears a single instrument playing a quarter step flat. Ray tested him, started an engine with a deliberately loosened rocker arm. Caden found it in 8 seconds, started another with a hairline crack developing in the exhaust manifold. Caden pointed to the exact cylinder in under a minute. Ray watched his son and said nothing for a while, and then said what he said only when something mattered enough to put into words. "You've got the ear, son. No school teaches that. No machine replicates it." There was one phrase Ray Ross said every single day. Every morning before they opened the garage. Every evening before they locked up. Sometimes in the middle of a repair when Caden was reaching for a tool without having listened first. "Listen before you touch. The engine tells you everything." Caden heard it so many times it stopped being language. It became something installed in him like a reflex, like the way your hand pulls back from heat before your brain processes the sensation. It was wired in, part of the machinery of him. Then Ray died. Caden was 14, a Tuesday in November. Routine brake job on a delivery truck. The jack failed, 7,000 pounds of steel on a man who weighed 180. The ambulance took 11 minutes. Ray was gone in 4. Caden didn't cry at the funeral. He went to the garage the next morning, sat on the overturned bucket, and looked at his father's tools on the pegboard for a long time. Each one in its place. Each one with years of use worn into the handle, the particular smoothness that comes from one man's grip repeated thousands of times until the tool remembers the hand. He picked up the 1/2-inch Craftsman, the one with the chip on the jaw, held it for a while without doing anything with it, just held it. Then he started working. For 4 years, he taught himself everything Ray hadn't had time to finish teaching. Library computers for tutorials. Engineering textbooks from the used bookstore on 7 Mile 50 cents each, covers torn pages stained with someone else's coffee from someone else's study sessions years before. He pulled engines from junk cars at the salvage yard on 8 Mile and rebuilt them on the garage floor and sold them to local shops for $50 or $100. Not enough. Never enough. But something. The garage went under when he was 16, then 2 jobs, then the fire escape and the notebooks and the closed eyes and the engines speaking to him at night from 3 floors down, when there was nothing he could do about any of it except listen and write it down and stay sharp and wait. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He just knew something his father had taught him without ever saying it directly, which was that the work finds the man who's ready for it. You prepare, you stay ready, and when the moment comes, you answer it. He didn't know the moment was coming on a Thursday in August on Michigan Avenue at a dead-end bar called the Iron Rail. He didn't know the moment was coming tonight. The Iron Rail sat at the dead end of Michigan Avenue, where the street stopped pretending to be something it wasn't. No sign above the door, no neon in the window, just a concrete building with the bones of something older underneath a warehouse maybe, or a factory floor from before the industry left and took the city's confidence with it. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and loose gravel and oil stains that went back decades, overlapping in geological layers the way history overlaps when nobody cleans anything up, when the record of everything that happened just stays pressed into the ground. By 7 in the evening, the lot was full of Harley-Davidsons, lined up with the precision of a military formation. Chrome pipes caught the low sun and threw it back in long horizontal bars of light. The sound of 15 engines arriving had rattled windows 3 blocks out an hour ago, and now the evening air still held the ghost of that thunder, a vibration that lingered in the concrete and the steel, and in the teeth of anyone who'd been standing close enough when they came in. The Hells Angels. Detroit chapter came to the Iron Rail every summer for what they called the gathering. 15 riders, sometimes 20. Decker Holt was the reason they came. Decker Holt had been president of the Detroit chapter for 11 years, and in those 11 years the gathering had happened exactly 11 times, and nobody had missed one. You didn't miss something Decker Holt organized. Not twice. Decker was 50 years old and looked like what happened when you put a man under maximum pressure for 30 years, and he didn't break, but he didn't bend either. He just compressed. Compressed into something denser than what most men were made of. 6'1", 220 pounds, the weight distributed in the specific way of men who have worked physical jobs their whole lives and never stopped. His hair was gray at the temples and cut short. His hands were the hands of a man who'd never spent a day behind a desk. There were 4 visible scars on his knuckles and prison ink on his left forearm from a stretch in the late 90s that he neither hid nor explained. His word inside the chapter was not a suggestion. It was not open to interpretation. It was the law of this particular country, and this parking lot was his country. His motorcycle was a 1972 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead. Black tank, black frame chrome pipes worn to a particular silver that only comes from decades of use and care. The chapter called it Black Fury. Decker never used the name out loud, but he didn't correct anyone who did. The bike had crossed every state line in the lower 48. His father, a man named Gerald Holt, who had built engines in a garage in Dearborn for 30 years, had assembled that engine by hand in 1971, before Decker was born, before Decker existed to understand what his father was doing in that garage or why. Gerald was gone now, had been gone for 6 years. The bike was the last physical thing on earth that his father's hands had built from the ground up, and Decker treated it accordingly. Nobody touched Black Fury, nobody sat on it, nobody leaned against it in a moment of casual thoughtlessness without understanding immediately from the quality of the silence that followed that they had made a serious mistake and would not make it again. So when Black Fury died on Interstate 94 3 days ago, the engine cutting out without warning in the left lane at 65 miles an hour, one moment full thunder and the next nothing, coasting to the shoulder with the traffic blowing past. Decker did not call a tow truck first. He called Mercer Bragg. Mercer Bragg ran the largest garage in Wayne County, 40 years in the business. His shop on Telegraph Road had 12 bays and 14 certified technicians, and a waiting list for appointments, and a wall behind his reception desk covered floor to ceiling with certificates and industry citations, and a photograph of Mercer shaking hands with the mayor of Detroit that was probably 8 years old, but still hung in the center position, because that was the kind of man Mercer Bragg was. He showed up at the Iron Rail in a company truck with 2 assistants and a diagnostic scanner that cost more than most people's cars. He spent 30 minutes under the hood. He stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and shook his head with the careful expression of a man delivering news he would prefer not to deliver, but has decided to deliver honestly because his professional reputation depends on honesty, even when honesty is unwelcome. Can't get a read on it. Could be the whole engine block. I'd need to take it into the shop, tear it down properly. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Decker looked at him for a long time without speaking. You're telling me you can't diagnose it? Here, tonight. I'm telling you it requires a controlled environment and the right equipment, and get out of my sight. Mercer left without another word. His assistants followed. Nobody in the parking lot said anything, but a few of them exchanged glances that Decker saw and filed away in the part of him that filed everything. Next came Slade Oren. Slade was the vintage Harley specialist in Michigan, the man that every collector and every serious rider called when they had a shovelhead or a panhead or a knucklehead that wouldn't cooperate, because Slade had been rebuilding old Harleys since before most of the bikers in this parking lot were born, and he had a reputation in that specific world that was essentially beyond question. He arrived without assistance, just himself and a worn leather tool bag that had more miles on it than some of the bikes in the lot. He spent 45 minutes on the carburetor, pulled it apart piece by piece with the methodical precision of a man who has done this particular thing so many times. The movements are entirely automatic, encoded in muscle rather than thought. Cleaned every jet, inspected every gasket, checked the float needle by feel, reassembled everything with the patient confidence of a specialist operating in his native territory, installed it back on the engine, stepped to the kickstart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Nothing. Not a cough, not a single cylinder trying to catch. Complete silence from a machine that should have been roaring. The carb is clean, Slade said. He said it to the engine, not to Decker. This motor has hit its wall. These old shovel heads, they reach a point. I've seen it a dozen times. The compression numbers tell me. Decker grabbed the front of Slade's shirt and pulled him close enough that Slade could smell the whiskey in the cigarettes, and something underneath both of those that was just Decker Holt, a particular quality of intensity that had no name that was safe to say out loud. You're supposed to be the best in the state. I am the best in the state, which is why I'm telling you the truth instead of taking your money and guessing. This engine is done. Decker held him there for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when someone is holding you by the shirt in a parking lot with 15 Hells Angels watching and nobody moving to help you. Then he shoved Slade away hard enough that Slade stumbled backward over his own tool bag and had to grab the fender of a parked bike to keep from going down. Get out. All of you. Useless. Slade gathered his tools and left without looking back. The crowd had grown while all this was happening. Word travels fast inside the specific geography of a public failure, especially when the failure belongs to someone powerful. There were 60 people pressed against the fence now, bikers from other chapters who'd heard through their networks that something worth watching was unfolding on Michigan Avenue, mechanics from nearby shops who'd received calls from colleagues, neighbors on porches. A handful of people who'd been walking past and stopped because 60 people standing still and watching, something creates its own gravity. Then came Whitmore Keach. Whitmore was something different from the 2 men who'd come before him. Former aerospace contractor turned motorcycle consultant, a job title that existed now because there were enough wealthy collectors willing to pay generously for the performance of expertise delivered with the right equipment and the right confidence. He arrived in a clean car with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a hard case for his diagnostic tools in the other hand. His clothes were pressed. He smiled when he got out of the car, the smile of a man who has already decided he knows the answer and is here primarily to confirm it for everyone else. He plugged in his systems, ran diagnostics, scrolled through data on his screen, cross-referenced wiring diagrams, made notes, looked thorough, looked expensive, looked precisely like the kind of professional that the 2 previous failures had been building toward the cavalry arriving after the scouts had fallen. 20 minutes. Then he stood up and delivered his assessment with the measured gravity of a doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. Full engine replacement, crankshaft cylinders, camshaft primary chain. We're looking at 8,000 minimum, possibly 12 depending on parts availability for a 1972 shovelhead. I can have quotes from 3 suppliers by Monday morning. Decker's jaw clenched. The muscles in his temples moved visibly. $8,000 to $12,000. from the third expert tonight, to fix a motorcycle that not one of you has actually managed to diagnose. Whitmore closed his laptop with the unhurried motion of a man who believes his assessment is simply correct, and that the other person's emotional response to it is not his professional responsibility to manage. I don't make the rules of physics, Mr. Holt. No, you just waste my time. Whitmore left, calm, collected, wrong. Decker stood alone next to Black Fury in the August heat. The sun was going down, but the heat wasn't going anywhere. It was stored in the concrete and the asphalt and the steel, and it radiated upward from everything, pressing down on the parking lot from above and rising from below at the same time. He reached into his vest and pulled out a roll of hundreds, $5,000 in cash. He set it on the folding table near the bar entrance, where 60 people and all the evening light could see it. $5,000, cash, right now. Anyone who makes her run in 1 hour takes it all. No bringing it to your shop. No comeback Monday. Right here tonight she runs or she doesn't. No excuses. Silence. The kind of silence that happens in a noisy parking lot when everyone stops talking at exactly the same moment, because everyone has understood at exactly the same moment that what is being offered is real and that nobody is going to take it. Not one hand, not one voice. $5,000 sitting in the August heat and not a single person in 60 willing to reach for it. That was when Caden Ross walked past. He wasn't walking fast. He was walking the specific walk of a person at the absolute end of a very long day, each step negotiated privately with what remained of his body's resources. He'd come off the gas station shift at 9 in the evening. The car wash had been 6 in the morning to noon. Between the two, he'd eaten a sandwich that Loretta had wrapped in wax paper and tucked into his backpack that morning. Eaten it standing up in the break room at the gas station between a snack machine and a mop bucket. That was the day. That was the whole of it. He was passing the iron rail on Michigan Avenue because Michigan Avenue was the route from the gas station to the bus stop that took him home, and he walked it 5 nights a week. And normally the iron rail was a building he walked past without looking at, because there was nothing about it that had anything to do with him or with anything he was trying to do or become. But tonight there was a crowd. And underneath the crowd, underneath the country music, leaking out through the bar's open door, underneath the 60 simultaneous conversations and the smell of gravel and hot chrome and exhaust residue baked into asphalt, Caden Ross heard something. It wasn't exactly a sound. It was the specific shape of an absence. A silence inside the larger noise that had texture to it, a metallic whisper coming from an engine at rest that was resting wrong. The silence of a machine that had been interrupted mid-sentence and left that way all that compressed potential sitting inside the metal with nowhere to go. He'd heard it before, in the garage on Graciot, 20 times at least, maybe more. Ray would bring him to a cold engine before they started work and ask him what he heard in the silence before they touched anything. And Caden would lean close and listen to the way metal holds its own temperature, the way it settles and breathes and contracts. And he would hear the quality of the silence, and it would tell him things. The way silence only tells things to people who have been taught to listen to it by someone who understood that silence is never actually empty. He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk outside the fence of the Iron Rails parking lot, and he listened, and he narrowed everything else out, and brought his attention down to just that engine. Just Black Fury's engine block, sitting 30 feet away, and he heard what the night air was carrying from it, and he knew the shape of it. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to know he had heard this particular shape before in the garage under Ray's instruction, and enough to know what hearing it meant. He was not going into there for the money. $11 was the world he lived in, and $5,000 was a number from somewhere else entirely, a number that didn't connect to anything real in the geography of his daily existence. He was going in there because there was a machine 30 feet away that was trying to say something, and he appeared to be the only person in 60 who could hear it. He walked toward the bike, hands in his pockets. No rush. Decker Holt spotted him from across the lot, registered the age, registered the shoes, registered the stained collar and the worn backpack strap, and the build of someone who has been eating less than he should for longer than he should have had to. He let Caden get to within 15 feet. The hell are you looking at? Caden looked from the bike to Decker. Your bike. I think I know what's wrong with it. Decker looked at the shoes, looked at the shirt, looked at the backpack. Then he laughed, but it was not a laugh that contained any humor. It was a laugh built specifically to diminish, to make whatever came next feel like the punchline to a joke that everyone in the lot had been in on from the start. You hear that, boys? This kid thinks he knows what's wrong with my bike. The crowd moved. Someone near the fence yelled something. Someone closer laughed. Brick Sour Decker's right hand, 6'4" and 260 pounds, with a skull tattoo that climbed from his collarbone to his jaw, walked over from where he'd been standing and flicked Caden's ear with 2 fingers. Not playing around. Hard enough to sting. Hard enough to establish what it was meant to establish. You're lost, little boy. Daycare's down the street. Another man came from behind, unzipped Caden's backpack while it was still on his back and upended it. The contents hit the asphalt. The wax paper from the morning sandwich stiff and flat. The water bottle. The library book. Fundamentals of Internal Combustion Engines, 3rd edition, with the handwritten notes in the margins. The man picked up the book. Read the title out loud in the voice of someone performing mockery for an audience. The crowd responded the way crowds respond when they've decided that something is funny and want to confirm it to each other. He held the book up for a moment longer, making sure everyone had a good look, then dropped it into a dark patch on the asphalt that was wet with oil or water or both, and stepped on it once deliberately and left it there. That's where your education belongs. Caden looked at the book on the ground. He crouched down and picked it up, wiped the cover carefully with the sleeve of his shirt, opened it and looked at the pages. Some of them had taken the oil. He smoothed them with his thumb, pressing gently along the spine where the pages had been bent. Then he put the book back in his bag and zipped it closed and stood up straight. Decker watched all of this with his arms crossed, the expression of a man performing patience while absorbing everything. You done? Or you need another lesson in how this works? Caden looked at him. His eyes were level. Not performing defiance, not concealing fear. Just steady the eyes of someone who has made a decision and is on the other side of it, where other people's reactions have stopped mattering to the outcome. I can fix it. Decker moved fast for a man his size. He closed the distance in 3 strides and put himself directly in Caden's space, close enough that Caden had to tilt his head back to hold the eye contact close enough that the smell of him arrived before the words did. Whiskey and tobacco and engine grease that had been living in leather for years. You see these hands? He held them up. The knuckles, the scar tissue across the first and second, the prison ink on the forearm below the rolled sleeve. These hands have put men in hospitals. You see these, brothers? He swept his arm across the semicircle of Hell's Angels that had closed around them, 15 men moving without instruction, the way a group moves when it has operated together long enough that it functions as a single organism. They've done worse. And you in your falling apart shoes and your car wash shirt, you're going to stand in my parking lot and tell me you can fix my father's motorcycle. He shoved Caden with both hands flat against his chest. Caden went back 4 steps, his backpack hitting the ground behind him. He didn't go down. He caught himself and steadied and looked back at Decker. You are nothing. You hear me? You are absolutely nothing. You wash cars. You stock shelves. You will never be anything more than exactly what you are standing here right now, which is a broke, nobody in the wrong parking lot on the wrong night. 60 phones up, recording. The live stream that someone in the crowd had started when Whitmore Keach arrived was still running, the viewer count climbing in the background, while everyone watched what was happening in the foreground. Nobody had checked it in 20 minutes. Had they checked it, they would have seen 4,000 viewers and the number moving upward steadily. Caden picked up his backpack. Again. Stood up straight. Again. 5 minutes, he said. If I can't fix it, I'll wash every bike in this lot for free. Every single one. If I can, you pay the $5,000 and you apologize. Out loud. In front of everyone here. The parking lot erupted. Bikers slamming their fists on the bar tables that had been dragged outside. People shouting. A half-full beer can sailed through the air and hit the asphalt 2 feet from Caden's left leg, shattering and spraying foam. He did not step back. Brick Sour turned to the crowd with his arms out. He wants an apology from the Detroit chapter. From Decker Holt. Decker tilted his head. The predator expression. The one that came before things people remembered afterward. And when you fail, because you will fail, you don't walk out of here on your own feet. You crawl, on your hands and knees, past every single person in this lot. Every one. Deal. Caden looked at him without hesitating. Deal. Decker spit on his palm and held it out. Caden looked at the hand, then he shook it. Decker held the grip a beat past the natural ending of a handshake, applying pressure, making sure Caden felt the full weight of what he'd just agreed to. At the edge of the parking lot near the fence where the crowd pressed thickest, a woman in a plain navy windbreaker over a white polo shirt stood with her hands at her sides and watched all of this without expression. She was 73 years old, gray hair pulled into a tight bun, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on Michigan Avenue and stopped, because the density of the crowd made her curious about what was worth 60 people's attention on a Thursday evening. Her name was Margaret Weld. She had spent 31 years as chief engineer in Harley-Davidson's powertrain division in Milwaukee. She held 4 patents on valve train geometry that were still in production. She had written the diagnostic manual that every Harley dealer in the country kept on the reference shelf. She was in Detroit visiting her daughter had made a wrong turn coming back from dinner, had seen the row of Harleys in the crowd, and had pulled over the way anyone with 31 years in the industry pulls over when they see vintage iron and something worth looking at. She had watched Mercer brag with his scanner. She had watched Slade Oren with his meticulous carburetor rebuild. She had watched Whitmore Keach with his laptop and his calibrated confidence. She had watched all 3 of them work, and she had kept her expression neutral and her thoughts to herself because 31 years in rooms where she was initially the only woman had taught her the very specific economy of knowing when to speak and when to wait. Now she watched a teenage boy in a stained shirt get shoved across an asphalt parking lot by the president of a motorcycle club pick himself up and offer a deal that no rational person in his position would offer. She watched his eyes while he said it. She had spent 31 years evaluating engineers under pressure, watching people work under conditions designed to reveal whether what they knew was real or whether it was performance. She understood the difference between bravado and actual knowledge at a level that had become involuntary after long enough. She didn't know yet which this was, but she did not laugh when the crowd laughed. She moved slightly closer to the bike and watched. A kid near the fence backwards cap cracked phone screen, held up his stopwatch app and yelled across the lot, 5 minutes, go. The timer started at 7:47 in the evening. Caden set his backpack on the ground. He unzipped it and removed the toolbox. Olive green dented at all 4 corners from years of a concrete garage floor. The letters R. Ross scratched into the lid in block letters not engraved, scratched by hand, uneven in the spacing, but permanent in the depth. He opened it. He laid the tools out on the asphalt in a row. The half-inch Craftsman wrench with the chip on the jaw, the quarter-inch socket set, a flathead screwdriver, a Phillips, a small flashlight with electrical tape wrapped around the handle where the housing had cracked. In the back pocket of the case, folded twice, edges gone soft from years of the same fold, a strip of emery cloth. That was everything. No scanner, no laptop, no voltage probe, no diagnostic equipment of any description. Decker looked at the row of tools and laughed the genuine laugh this time, the one that didn't need construction. You're kidding me. That's it. My daughter's toy set has more in it than that. Brick crouched down and swept the socket set across the asphalt with the back of his hand. Sockets scattered in different directions. Oops. Hope you didn't need those. Caden walked to each socket and picked it up, placed them back in the case in order. He did not do this quickly or with any sign of agitation. He did it the way Ray had always done it, each piece going to its place, because there was a right place, and the right place was not optional, and doing it any other way was not something Ray Ross's son was going to do in front of 60 people or anywhere else. Brick stepped close and stood directly over him while he was still crouched, cutting off the light. 4 minutes 30. Better start thinking about that crawl. Caden stood. He picked up the flashlight and the Craftsman, and he walked to Black Fury and he knelt beside the engine. He closed his eyes and placed both palms flat against the engine block. The crowd noise dropped, not because anyone stopped talking, because the specific quality of the stillness that came over Caden when his hands touched the metal had a pull to it, the way certain silences pull at attention before you've registered that you're paying attention. He's praying, someone said. The kid is actually praying to the motorcycle. Someone else, get him off before he drools on the chrome. A beer can hit the asphalt near his knee and rolled. Decker cupped his hands around his mouth. Clock's running, kid. You here to fix a bike or take a nap? Caden didn't hear any of it. His palms were against the cooling fins, his fingers spread across the cylinder heads. He was feeling the metal the way Ray had taught him, not with his hands but through them. The difference was everything. The engine had been sitting for 3 days, Metal holds its experience the way scar tissue holds the memory of a wound, in the specific way it has distorted and relaxed and settled. The cooling fins had their own story. The gasket surfaces had compressed under heat and released into stillness in a pattern that meant something if you knew how to read it. He listened. Then he leaned in and pressed his ear against the rocker cover. Tapped the engine block 3 times with one knuckle. Light and precise, spaced 2 seconds apart. Like a doctor checking a heartbeat by percussion. Like a man asking a question and waiting to hear the answer and the quality of the response. Something shifted in Decker's expression. His arms were still crossed and his jaw was still set, but his eyes moved in a way they hadn't moved before. Because he had watched 3 professional mechanics approach Black Fury tonight with scanners and tool bags and decades of certificates, and none of them had touched the bike like this. None of them had been this still. None of them had listened to anything. 40 seconds in and he's romancing my engine, Decker said, but the timing of it was off. The words arriving a beat late because part of him was watching something he didn't have a word for. Caden opened his eyes. He picked up the flashlight, directed it at the primary chain cover, held it 3 seconds, moved it to the carburetor bowl, 3 seconds, moved it to the frame rail where the engine ground strap met the steel at the junction bolt. 3 seconds. He stood up. 3 problems, he said, quiet and level to himself more than to anyone else, the way Ray used to speak a diagnosis aloud when it was still forming, because making the air hear it was part of committing to it. Not 1, 3 separate faults. That's why no one could fix it. Each of them found one thing, decided it was everything, and stopped looking. Decker's face changed color. The color came from somewhere below the anger, from a place that didn't usually surface. 3 problems in 40 seconds, when the best mechanic in Wayne County couldn't find one in 30 minutes with a $4,000 scanner. Caden held his gaze. Mercer Bragg was looking with his eyes and his equipment. I listened. Those are different tools. Decker stepped forward fast and grabbed Caden by the back of the neck and turned him to face the crowd. Did everyone hear that? He listened. Standing ovation, boys. The engine whisperer. Somebody get this kid a sandwich because he looks like he hasn't eaten since Monday. The crowd roared. Brick mimicked Caden's pose palms on an invisible engine. Eyes shut, mouth slightly open, swaying like a man in a trance. And the laughter built on itself the way laughter does when a crowd has decided something is the funniest thing that's happened tonight. Someone started the chant. Crawl, crawl, crawl. At the edge of the lot, Margaret Weld was no longer watching the crowd. She was watching Caden's hands, the angle of his wrist when he'd directed the flashlight, the placement of his fingers when he'd been on the cylinder head, the specific pressure and timing of the 3 knuckle taps. This was not instinct. This was not something learned from a screen. This was trained movement, the kind that comes from a specific person putting specific knowledge into a younger person's hands through repetition and correction over years until the movement lives in the body and not in the mind. She had seen it happen twice in 31 years. Both times the person it had happened to went on to do exceptional work. She took out her phone, not to record. She opened her timer and started it. 3 minutes and 30 seconds remained. She moved slightly closer to Black Fury and uncrossed her arms and watched Caden Ross pick up his father's wrench and take one breath and begin. The first bolt came off in 3 seconds. Not 3 seconds of searching for the angle or repositioning or second-guessing. 3 seconds from the moment the craftsman's jaw touched the bolt, head to the moment the bolt was sitting in Caden's left palm. The cam cover lifted clean from the engine with no resistance, no hesitation, with the ease of someone who has made this exact motion on this exact type of engine enough times that the body executes it before the mind finishes the instruction. The crowd noise dropped another register. Under the cam cover, the timing chain sat exposed. A long loop of roller chain connecting the cam sprocket at the top to the crankshaft sprocket at the bottom. The mechanical link between the engine's top and bottom halves. The component whose precise alignment determined whether the valves opened and closed in the exact relationship to the pistons that the combustion process required. On a healthy shovel head, the chain would be taut and perfectly centered. Every link seated on every tooth with the precision of something that had been performing this function for decades without interruption. This chain was not seated correctly. Caden put the flashlight on the cam sprocket and held it there for 4 seconds. In the circle of white light, the problem was visible to anyone who knew what correct looked like, and invisible to anyone who didn't, which explained precisely why 3 professionals had missed it. The chain had walked forward on the sprocket. Two teeth, two positions off from where it needed to be. On a modern engine with electronic sensors, this would have produced an error code immediately, a warning light, a diagnostic flag that pointed directly to the problem. On a 1972 shovelhead with mechanical points ignition, there were no sensors. There were no codes. There were no flags. There was only the engine's behavior, and the engine's behavior was simply refusal to fire, which could mean 100 different things and had apparently meant 100 different things to the three men who came before Caden tonight. Timing chain two teeth off meant the valves were opening and closing fractions of a second out of phase with the pistons. Fractions of a second. The margin between an engine that fires and an engine that doesn't can be that small. The compression couldn't build because the valves weren't in the right place when the pistons needed them to be. The fuel couldn't ignite. The engine sat there cranking, doing every mechanical motion it was designed to do, missing only the synchronization that made all those motions combine into combustion. Caden reached in, loosened the cam sprocket. Bolt rotated the sprocket backward by hand. Two positions felt the chain reseat under his fingers with the small, precise movement of something returning to where it belonged. Tightened the bolt back. Tested the chain tension with his thumb at the midpoint between sprockets, measuring the deflection against the standard his hands carried from every similar repair on every similar engine in the years since Ray taught him what correct felt like. 12 seconds total, from the cam cover lifting to the bolt retorqued and the cover replaced. Mercer Bragg was standing at the fence near the back of the crowd. He had stayed, which meant he had watched, which meant he was now doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. 30 minutes with a scanner that cost more than most people's monthly income. He hadn't touched the cam cover. His scanner worked by reading electronic signals from sensors, and the 1972 shovelhead had no electronic sensors, no architecture for the scanner's language to find and interpret. He had brought the right instrument to the wrong conversation and spent 30 minutes listening for a reply in a language the machine didn't speak. The boy had spent 12 seconds fixing what he hadn't found because the boy had used the right instrument, which was a set of hands and ears trained for this exact type of machine by a man who understood it. Mercer pressed his shop rag against his face and held it there for a moment. Caden looked up from the engine. That's one. Decker's jaw moved. His eyes went from the cam cover to Caden's face and back. The cover was off and the chain was seated, and the time it had taken to do it was the time it took most mechanics to find their first tool. Lucky guess, Decker said. His voice had shed some of its volume without losing any of its edge. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. He raised it back up for the crowd's benefit. One lucky poke doesn't make you a mechanic. My grandmother could have knocked that chain back if she tripped on the right thing. You want applause? You want me to stop the whole show right now and applaud? He slow clapped, deliberate and loud. The crowd joined in with the mocking rhythm. Clap louder, boys. The car wash kid fixed one thing. Somebody call the mayor. Call the television stations. Brick stepped in from the right side and grabbed Caden's shoulder and spun him around so he was facing away from the engine. Leaned in close. One lucky find. Touch that engine again, and I will take that wrench and make sure you never hold one again. You hear me? Caden turned back to the engine without responding. Brick held his position for a moment, large and deliberate, then stepped back. Not because he decided to, because whatever he was going to do, this wasn't the moment for it, not with the clock running and the phones recording and 4,000 people watching from wherever they were watching from. Caden picked up the Phillips screwdriver and positioned himself at the carburetor. Worked the 4-bowl screws, quarter turns, the bowl coming free in the sequence he'd learned from Ray on a Tuesday afternoon when Caden was 11 years old, and Ray had come home from the salvage yard with a Cahin butterfly carburetor, like he was bringing back something worth having. He remembered that afternoon with the specific clarity that belongs to the things you learn when you are young enough that learning is the same as becoming. Not just the carburetor, but the quality of the light in the garage at that hour, the way it came through the window at an angle and lit up the suspended dust so the air looked like it was made of something. Ray setting the carburetor on the bench and saying, "Come here," and walking him through every component twice, once with full instruction and once blindfolded. Both of them. Ray with his eyes covered by a shop rag, naming every part by touch, with the confidence of someone for whom the world of small metal components was as familiar as the faces of people he loved. Then saying, "Now you and Caden trying." He could still feel the weight of the float from that afternoon, the way it pivoted, the specific range of motion it was supposed to have. The bowl came off. He set it on the asphalt and directed the flashlight inside. The float was a small brass assembly, a miniature pontoon designed to ride on the surface of the fuel in the bowl and regulate through a needle valve. How much gasoline entered the carburetor throat? Rise with the fuel, close the valve. Drop with the fuel, open the valve. The simplest possible mechanical regulation, elegant in its directness. This float was not moving freely through its range. Caden leaned in and looked at the pivot point. The float arm was supposed to swing through 45 degrees of arc. It was moving through 10. He positioned his index finger at the pivot and applied pressure at 15 degrees off the central axis, the specific angle where a particular type of debris would be applying its resistance if it was what he thought it was. He pressed. Something came free. He held it up to the flashlight. Smaller than a grain of rice. A fragment of hardened gasket material old enough to have become rigid, wedged between the float arm and the bowl wall, at an angle that made it invisible from every direction, except the one direction you would only know to look from if you had read a specific document written 41 years ago. Invisible when the carburetor was assembled. Invisible when the bowl was off and the float was at rest. Invisible when you press the float straight down, which was what anyone doing a standard float test would do. With the float stuck at 10 degrees instead of 45, the needle valve had been held permanently open. Fuel poured continuously into the throat. The cylinders flooded. Raw gasoline pooled on the crown of each piston. A flooded cylinder cannot compress because gasoline is not compressible. It hydraulic locks the piston in place, and a locked piston cannot fire. Every attempt to start the engine had been pushing fuel into cylinders that were already full of it. Even if the timing chain had been perfectly aligned from the beginning, this alone would have guaranteed silence. Caden held the fragment between his thumb and forefinger so the flashlight caught it and said what he was seeing the way Ray always said it to the air before committing. Float stuck open. Debris at the pivot point. Fuel pouring straight through every time you tried to start it. Both cylinders flooded. From the far edge of the crowd came a disturbance, the sound of someone pushing through bodies without asking permission. Slade Oren came to the front, with his face carrying an expression that had gone past embarrassment into something more complicated, the look of a man watching the specific foundation his professional identity is built on develop a crack in public. I checked that float. I checked it twice. His voice was louder than the situation required, which was how you could tell he was frightened. Caden did not look up from reinstalling the carburetor bowl. You checked it assembled and you pressed it straight down. The debris only shows at 15 degrees off axis. It's a known failure point on pre-74 K-HINs. Harley issued a technical service bulletin in 1978. Bulletin number HD-78-041. He said the number, the way Ray had always said things, he had committed to memory, not performing the recall, but simply reporting what was accurate. The crowd noise shifted. Not the laughter of before. Something different. The particular murmur of a large group of people recalibrating simultaneously, the sound of 60 individual judgments changing direction at the same moment. At the edge of the lot, Margaret Weld had gone still. Bulletin HD-78-041. She had written that bulletin, not in 1978. She had joined Harley's powertrain division in 1976, and in 1984, her 8th year, she had spent 3 weeks at her desk on Juneau Avenue in Milwaukee, documenting a series of field reports about float pivot failures in the K-HIN carburetor used on shovel heads from 1972 through 1974. She had bench-tested the failure mode herself, identified the debris pattern, established the 15-degree off-axis test, and written 14 pages of supplemental diagnostic guidance that became Bulletin HD-78-041. The bulletin was 41 years old now. This 18-year-old had quoted its number from memory while kneeling on asphalt with 60 people looking down at him. Her hand was flat against her hip. She could feel her own pulse in her palm. Slade stepped forward, his voice climbing. That bulletin applies to specific configurations. You can't just assume Margaret did not look at him. She was watching Caden's hands complete the reinstallation of the carburetor bowl. Slade, she said. One word, flat and certain and without any heat in it at all. He stopped. He looked at her. Something in the specific quality of her voice, the voice of someone who has spent decades being heard in rooms full of people who started out disinclined to listen, made him stop the way a wall makes forward motion. Stop. You checked the float assembled, she said. He's right about the angle. Step back. Slade looked at her for a moment. He didn't know who she was, but he stepped back. Decker had watched this exchange from 6 feet away. He moved now, cutting the distance to Caden in 2 strides, reaching down and grabbing the front of Caden's shirt with both hands, lifting him off his knees and onto his feet in a single motion that popped 2 buttons and stretched the collar past recovery. He put his face close. "So you memorized a number. My grandmother memorizes bingo numbers every Friday night. Doesn't make her an engineer. Doesn't make her a damn thing." "Two down," Caden said. His voice was level. The shirt was ruined and the buttons were gone, and he said it level. Decker's face went the dark red that comes before decisions that can't be walked back. The veins in his forearms showed through the skin where his grip tightened. Two fines. A blind man finds his way to the bathroom twice a night. Doesn't make him a surgeon. Don't stand in front of my brothers and act like you're something because you are not something. You found 2 things. One more word out of your mouth before this is done, and I will make sure that mouth never opens again." He held the grip for 3 seconds. Then he let go, and Caden stumbled slightly and caught the edge of Black Fury's frame and straightened. Brick walked to the toolbox and kicked it across the asphalt. Tools scattered for the second time in the same evening. The socket set going one direction, the screwdrivers another, the flashlight rolling and stopping against a tire. Tick-tock, clocks running, garbage boy. Caden walked to the toolbox. He picked it up. He found each scattered tool on the asphalt and placed it back in its position in the case. Phillips beside the flathead, sockets set in order by size, Craftsman on the side hook, flashlight on top. He did this at the same pace as always because his father had believed that how you treated your tools was how you treated your work, and how you treated your work was the most honest statement a person made about who they were. And Caden was not going to make a different statement in front of 60 people than he made alone. Across the lot, something was changing in the character of the crowd without anyone deciding to change it. 2 people near the fence had stopped recording and were just watching. The woman who'd been live streaming from the picnic table had let her arm drop, the phone still running, but no longer held up deliberately. The old man near the back had taken his hat off and was holding it against his chest with both hands. The way people hold hats at funerals or at moments they understand are significant without being able to say exactly why. The viewer count on the live stream had passed 6,000. 1 minute and 40 seconds remained. Caden reached into his back pocket and felt the strip of emery cloth, folded twice the edges, worn soft from years of the same fold. He had carried it every day since Ray died. Ray had kept one in his left back pocket every working day for as long as Caden could remember. And when they'd gone to the garage the morning after the funeral to begin the process of understanding what came next, Caden had found the last one in the pocket of Ray's coveralls hanging on the hook inside the door. He had kept that strip until it wore away through use, then kept the habit, the practice, the daily carrying of it, which was a way of maintaining something he couldn't have named precisely but couldn't stop doing. He left it in his pocket. He had one problem left and 1 minute 40 seconds, and he was not going to rush the third problem because the third problem was the one that would have stayed invisible indefinitely. It was the one nobody would have found. He lay down flat on the asphalt with his back against the ground and slid himself partially under the frame. The crowd pressed closer. 60 phones tilted downward at him, the screens glowing in the evening air like a ring of small moons. 4,000 viewers, then 5 watching a teenager lying on his back under a motorcycle with a running clock, and the president of the Detroit Hells Angels chapter standing over everything. The live stream chat was moving too fast to read individual comments. Whitmore Keach had not left. He drifted toward the back of the crowd after the carburetor toward the place where the crowd was thinner and the exit was closer, but he had not gone. And now he pushed forward again because his professional instincts, which had been telling him things confidently all evening and had been wrong about everything, were still talking. They kept talking even after the evidence against them piled up. The way certain kinds of advisors keep advising, past the point where anyone should still be listening to them. He came to the front, looked down at Caden under the frame, and opened his laptop again, the screen bright against the evening air. The ground fault is not in the frame circuit. I ran a full continuity check from the battery terminal. There is no resistance signature on any ground path. Whatever he thinks he's looking at down there, the data doesn't support it. He said it to the crowd, not to Caden, the recovering posture of a man trying to reassert standing in a situation that has been eroding it. Caden's flashlight found the ground wire junction under the frame, the bolt connecting the engine's ground strap to the frame rail. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he reached up and drew his thumbnail across the contact surface between the strap and the rail. His thumbnail came away green. Copper carbonate. The oxidation that forms on copper when it's exposed to moisture and road salt over months or years. The ground strap was copper. The frame rail was steel. At the junction bolt where current was supposed to flow from the engine block through the strap and into the frame and complete the ignition circuit, a microscopic layer of oxidation had developed between the two contact surfaces over the course of a winter's worth of riding. Not on the wire, not on the bolt. On the contact point itself, the quarter-inch circle where metal met metal and current had to cross. The bolt was tight. The wire was intact. Whitmore Keach's continuity check had touched the wire on both sides of the junction and found no break because there was no break in the wire. The resistance wasn't in the wire. It was at the contact surface in the layer of oxidation that added just enough electrical resistance to reduce the spark from the ignition points below the threshold needed to ignite the fuel mixture. Not enough to show on a voltage reading taken from the battery terminals. More than enough to kill every attempt to start a 53-year-old engine that needed everything it was built to receive. Caden said from under the frame, still looking at the junction, "The resistance is at the contact surface under the bolt head, not in the wire, at the junction itself. Copper carbonate from road salt. It's been building since last winter, probably longer. Getting worse every ride. Weakening the spark a little more each time until there wasn't enough left to fire." He looked at Whitmore Keach's screen from his position on the asphalt. "Your probe touched the wire on both sides of the junction. You measured the wire's continuity. You didn't measure the contact surface because you can't reach the contact surface with a probe while the bolt is installed. This machine doesn't have sensors. It doesn't have an ECU. It doesn't generate the kind of data your software exists to read. You brought the right instrument to the wrong machine." Whitmore looked at the screen, looked at the junction, looked at the screen again. Margaret Weld stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Not quickly. With the deliberate pace of someone who has decided that the edge is no longer the right place to be and is moving to a better position. She said, and her voice moved through the ambient noise of the parking lot, the way certain voices do when they have spent decades being heard in rooms that started out resistant to hearing them. "He's correct. The junction surface is the measurement point. Probing either end of the strap measures wire continuity, not contact resistance. On a vintage points ignition system with no digital architecture, this is the most commonly missed diagnosis in the field. Your equipment is not wrong. It is designed for machines. This machine predates by 20 years. Whitmore Keach looked at her. He had not seen her before tonight. She was a woman in a Navy windbreaker who looked like someone's grandmother, and who had just explained his professional error in 2 sentences, using the vocabulary of someone who had not guessed at a single word. He closed the laptop, looked at it for a moment, sitting closed in his hands. Then he picked up his equipment case and walked toward the parking lot exit without speaking to Decker or to the crowd or to anyone. Got in his clean car and left. The crowd watched him go. The specific silence that follows a man leaving without explanation settled briefly over everything and then lifted. Decker looked at the woman who had made Whitmore Keach leave without a word. He stored the question he had about her. Caden reached into his back pocket and took out the emery cloth. He unfolded it. The cloth was soft at the edges from 4 years of the same fold and unfold. Ray had kept a strip in his left back pocket every working day for as long as Caden had been alive and aware of such things. When they'd come to the garage the morning after the funeral, Caden had found the last one in the pocket of the coveralls on the hook by the door. He'd kept it. Not that exact strip which had worn away through use over the following months, but the habit of carrying one, which was the thing that outlasted the physical object, which was what Ray had actually given him. He pressed the cloth against the contact surface between the ground strap and the frame rail. Short, firm strokes in the same direction. The green came away first, then the brown beneath it, then the bright copper of the original surface, revealing itself as clean and conductive and ready to do what it had been made to do. He worked the full area of the contact circle, made sure every bit of oxidation was gone, repositioned the ground strap so the clean copper surface sat fully and evenly against the clean steel of the frame rail. He tightened the bolt by feel, firm to seated, then a quarter turn beyond seated to make sure road vibration wouldn't work the surfaces apart and let the oxidation start again. He slid out from under the bike, stood up, brushed the gravel from the back of his arms and the back of his shirt. "Bad ground," he said. "Corroded junction at the frame bolt. The oxidation was blocking current to the ignition coil. She's been losing spark for months. getting weaker every time someone kicked her over until there was nothing left to fire. He walked to the toolbox, placed the emery cloth back in the rear pocket of the case, placed each tool in its position, wrench on the side hook, sockets set in order, screwdrivers beside them, flashlight on top. He closed the lid. He looked at the letters scratched there. R. Ross, his father's name. His father's handwriting, such as it was. In the letters scratched into olive green metal with whatever sharp thing had been at hand in the garage on Graciette Avenue on whatever day Ray had decided the box needed marking. That's 3. The parking lot went quiet in a way that was different from every other quiet it had produced tonight. Not the nervous quiet of 60 people watching a situation develop. Not the anticipatory quiet of a crowd waiting for a punchline. This was the quiet of 60 people who have been wrong about something in front of each other and have arrived simultaneously at the moment of understanding exactly how wrong they were and who have not yet worked out what to do with that knowledge. 60 phones still recording, nobody typing comments. The live stream chat had gone nearly still. Not because the viewers had left the count was past 8,000 now, but because 8,000 people were watching something that did not have adequate language yet. Mercer Bragg stood at the fence where he'd been standing for the timing chain and the carburetor and the ground junction. He was a good mechanic. He had been a good mechanic for 40 years, and the certificates on his wall were legitimate, and the experience behind them was real. He was looking at the engine and understanding with the clarity that only arrives when the evidence makes avoidance impossible. That he had walked up to a 1972 shovelhead with the assumptions and instruments of a world the shovelhead existed before. His scanner spoke a language the machine didn't speak. He had listened for 47 minutes for a response in that language and heard nothing, and then an 18-year-old with a flashlight and a strip of emery cloth had diagnosed and repaired 3 separate faults in under 4 minutes, because the 18-year-old had used the right approach for this machine, which was to listen to it in the language it actually spoke. He took the shop rag from his pocket and held it against his face for a moment, then put it back and looked at his feet. Slade Orrin was at the far side of the crowd with his arms crossed and his eyes on the ground. He had checked the float. He had checked it twice. His standard procedure for a Cahin carburetor rebuild was thorough, and his 30 years of experience performing it were genuine. His standard procedure did not include the 15-degree off-axis test, because in 30 years, the specific debris pattern described in Bulletin HD-78-041 had either not presented itself to him or had presented itself and been attributed to something else. 30 years was a long time to go without reading page 9 of a supplemental diagnostic guide issued in 1984. He would read it tonight. He already knew he would. Margaret Weld had moved to within 10 feet of Black Fury. She stood just outside the inner ring of bikers with her hands loose at her sides, and she was looking at the engine with the eyes of someone who has spent 31 years knowing exactly what a correctly completed repair looks like, and is looking at 3 of them. The cam cover reinstalled cleanly. The carburetor bowl back in place, float arms swinging free through its full range. The ground junction clean copper against clean steel bolt torqued correctly. From here, from 10 feet away in the diminishing evening light, everything she could see looked exactly right. She needed to verify. She needed her hands on it. But she waited, because there was a sequence, and the sequence had one thing left. Decker Holt had not spoken in a minute and a half. For a man who had controlled the sound level of this parking lot for the past 2 hours, with the ease of someone who considers that kind of control to be his natural right. A minute and a half of silence was a significant event. He stood 6 feet from his motorcycle. His arms were at his sides, not crossed, not clenched. He was looking at Caden's hands where they rested on the lid of the toolbox. The hands he had called dirty and worthless. The hands that had just done what they'd done. He looked at the toolbox, at the letters on the lid. He had looked at it earlier and laughed. He looked at the letters now differently. R. Ross. He looked at them for a moment. He had watched 3 professional mechanics fail to diagnose what a teenager in splitting shoes had just diagnosed and fixed in under 4 minutes. The first thing he had thought when Caden walked into the lot was that the kid was nothing, was exactly what the shoes and the stained shirt and the worn backpack advertised, was less than what the situation required by every visible measure he knew how to apply. He had not been wrong about the visible measures. The shoes were still splitting, the shirt was still stained. None of that had changed. What had changed was his understanding of what visible measures actually measured. Brick Sauer was 6 feet to Decker's left, and he had stopped making noise nearly 2 minutes ago. He was looking at the ground between his boots. He had threatened to break the fingers that had just done what they'd done. He had kicked the toolbox twice. He was the largest person in this parking lot, and he was making himself small in it not from a decision, but from the automatic response of a man who cannot look at what he's done and has not yet begun the work of understanding what comes next. The teenager with the stopwatch looked at his screen, then up at Caden, then at the screen. He held it up so the people near him could see. The timer read 1 minute and 9 seconds remaining. Caden had done all 3 repairs in 3 minutes and 51 seconds. Margaret Weld stepped into the inner ring. She moved through the circle of bikers without asking permission, and nobody moved to stop her, which was interesting because these were not men who generally made way for anyone without being asked. Something about the way she moved through space made the space open for her. She knelt beside Black Fury. She pressed 2 fingers against the timing chain through the open cam cover and checked the tension. Checked the alignment. Correct. She moved to the carburetor, pressed the float arm, and felt it swing freely through its complete range of motion, the needle valve clicking cleanly at the top of the stroke. Correct. She drew her thumbnail across the ground junction contact surface. Bright copper. No oxidation. Bolt torqued to what felt like exactly the right specification for this application. Correct. She stood, took the time to stand fully and deliberately so that the standing itself communicated something. She looked at Decker Holt. Every single one, she said. Quiet enough that only Decker and Caden and the 2 bikers immediately beside them could hear it. Every diagnosis correct. Every repair correctly executed. I have trained engineers for 3 decades. Most of them could not do what this young man just did. None of them could do it this fast. Decker looked at her. The question he'd been storing was back. Who are you? Not a question. A demand for information he had understood he needed. Margaret reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and produced a business card. She held it, not yet extending it, just held it where it was visible. Someone who knows what she's looking at, she said. And right now, I am looking at the best diagnostic work I've seen performed on a vintage shovelhead in 31 years of looking at them. She did not offer the card to Decker. She put it back in her pocket and looked at Caden. Caden looked at Black Fury, at the engine, at the 3 points he had opened and listened to and repaired in the time it had taken the crowd to stop laughing. He looked at Decker. Try it, he said. Decker stood for a long moment. He was a man who gave instructions. He had given them for 30 years in various capacities and for 11 years in this one. He was not a man who took them from other people, and certainly not from teenagers with $11 in their pockets. He walked to Black Fury, swung his leg over the seat with the automatic ease of 30 years of the same motion, the body not requiring input from the mind for a thing it has done 10,000 times. His hands found the grips in their worn positions, the rubber shaped to his palms by decades of use. His right boot found the kickstart pedal. He stopped. Half a second. The hesitation of a man who has been told something is possible and is about to find out if the person who told him was right and who understands that the finding out is going to change something regardless of the answer. 8,000 people watching from wherever they were watching. He kicked. The engine turned over once. A dry mechanical rotation, the sound of compression building and releasing the sound of something being asked to wake up. Then silence. Caden's expression did not change, not a flicker. Decker kicked again. Black Fury caught. 1 cylinder fired. A single explosion in the combustion chamber, the fundamental event at the center of every internal combustion engine ever built, contained violence converted to directed force. Then the second cylinder. Then both together, finding the synchronization that the timing chain now correctly delivered, and the float now correctly enabled, and the clean ground junction now correctly powered. All 3 systems doing what they had been designed to do at exactly the moment they needed to do it. And the engine came alive with a sound that rolled out from the iron rail and up Michigan Avenue in both directions. The sound of a 1972 Harley-Davidson shovelhead does not live in the ears. It lives in the chest. It operates at a frequency closer to the frequency of the body than most mechanical sounds do, so that you feel it resonating in your sternum before your ears have finished processing it. A low, deep, steady drumming that Gerald Holt had designed by hand in a garage in Dearborn more than 50 years ago, and that his son had carried across every state line in the lower 48. And that had been silent for 3 days, and that was silent no longer. Black Fury settled into her idle. Deep, steady, patient. The exhaust note barked twice as the engine found its baseline rhythm and then smoothed into the tempo it had maintained across 100,000 miles. 3 blocks away, a woman on a porch looked up from her phone. 2 blocks away, a boy on a bicycle put his feet down. 1 block away, a man in a parked car turned off his radio and sat listening to something he couldn't quite identify. Something that sounded like it mattered even from here. The timer read 4 minutes and 51 seconds, 9 seconds to spare. Nobody moved. Not one of the 60 people in that parking lot moved for the first 3 seconds after Black Fury's engine caught and settled, because those 3 seconds belonged entirely to the sound, and the sound did not leave room for anything else. It had filled the parking lot, in the evening air above it, in the street beyond the fence, and something in the quality of it made everyone present understand at the same moment that what had just happened was not what they had expected to happen when the kid in the splitting shoes walked into the lot, and the understanding was arriving in all of them at the same time, and it was too large to respond to immediately. Decker sat on Black Fury with both hands on the grips and his knuckles white. He revved the throttle once. The engine answered instantly, no hesitation, no stumble, climbing and falling, with the precision of a machine that has been given back exactly what it needed. He revved it again. The same clean response, crisp and immediate. His jaw was set hard enough that the muscles at his temples were moving with each breath. His eyes were wet, not from the exhaust, from something that lived deeper than that in a man who did not keep words for it. Gerald Holt had assembled this engine in 1971, had kicked it to life for the first time on a November morning in the garage in Dearborn, had ridden it for 15 years before passing it to Decker without ceremony, just the keys and a look that said everything the words would have gotten wrong. Gerald had been gone for 6 years. The bike was what remained of him in the physical world, the last thing his hands had built from components to completion. For 3 days, Decker had believed that last thing was finished. Had listened to 3 men who had been wrong in sequence tell him so. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was its own presence in the lot. Not the absence of sound, but the shape of it, the particular dimension of quiet that follows something large. He sat on the bike with both hands on the grips for a moment, looking down at the black tank, the chrome his father had chosen for reasons Decker had never asked about and would never have the chance to ask about now. Then he swung his leg off and stood. The dam had broken while the engine was running. The woman near the fence who'd been live streaming had made a sound that wasn't a word. The teenager with the stopwatch had looked at 4 minutes and 51 seconds on his screen and dropped the phone onto the asphalt screen first without looking down at it. The old man in the back was pressing his hat against his chest with both hands. The applause had started with one person, a man in his 50s near the bar entrance, who had come outside to see what was happening and had stayed for reasons he couldn't have articulated, who began clapping not as a performance, but as the simple, involuntary response of hands that had decided on their own. From him it spread outward through the crowd, not in an organized wave, but in the irregular pattern of fire moving through material that isn't evenly dry. Jumping from person to person until within 10 seconds, 60 people were on their feet, and the sound of it filled the lot the way the engine had filled it differently, but with the same sense of something that had been held back suddenly released. The live stream chat was moving faster than any individual comment could be read. Brick Sauer stood exactly where he'd been standing when the engine caught and had not moved. He was a man who occupied space with the automatic authority of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt that the space belongs to him. He was not occupying it that way now. He was standing in it the way you stand in space. You are no longer sure is yours, smaller than his size, looking at a spot on the asphalt between his boots. He had threatened to break the fingers on the hands that had done what the hands had just done. He had kicked the toolbox across the asphalt. He had stood close to block the light from above while those hands worked. He was looking at the asphalt and could not make himself look at anything else. Decker walked to where Caden was standing. He moved through the noise of the crowd, and the noise didn't reach him. He stopped in front of Caden, close enough that the space between them was the space of a real conversation. He looked at Caden's eyes. He had looked at them before earlier in the evening as a tool of pressure. He was looking at them now differently, the way you look at something when everything around it has changed so completely that the thing itself looks different even though nothing about it has changed. The eyes were what they had been, level and steady. The eyes that had not moved when he was shoved, not when he was spit on, not when his books were dumped in a puddle of oil and stepped on, not when he was lifted off his knees by his shirt front. The same eyes that had looked at a dying engine with a focus so absolute that 60 people in a running clock had simply ceased to be part of the relevant world. Decker opened his mouth, closed it. Something was happening in the machinery of him that required parts he had not used in a long time, parts that had stiffened from disuse the way joints stiffen when you stop moving them. He was trying to reach something, and the reaching was slow and was happening in front of 10,000 people, which made it slower. He said, "Who taught you?" It wasn't what he had intended to say. He hadn't intended anything. But that was what came out, because that was the actual question, the one underneath everything else, the one that Black Fury firing had made unavoidable. Caden looked at him. My father. Decker looked at the toolbox, at the letters on the lid, R. Ross. He looked at them for a moment. People in the crowd would later describe his expression differently depending on where they'd been standing and what they'd brought with them. Some said he looked angry. Some said he looked like a man who had lost something. One woman who had been close enough said to her husband in the car afterward quietly that he looked like a man who had just understood something he should have understood a long time ago and was doing the arithmetic on how long ago that was. What Decker understood standing in front of Caden Ross in the parking lot of the Iron Rail on a Thursday evening in August was not a thing he could have put into words, even if he'd been a man who put things into words, which he was not. It was this Black Fury was Gerald Holt's hands. Gerald was gone, and the bike was what remained of those hands in the world. For 3 days, Decker had believed the bike was finished, that the last physical evidence of his father's work and skill and care had finally given out, and that loss had been sitting on him with a weight he hadn't named because naming it would have required words he didn't keep. And the boy in front of him was carrying the same thing, in the same way. The letters on the toolbox, the chip on the jaw of the craftsman, the emery cloth in the back pocket. These were not just tools and habits. They were the physical form of a man who was gone and the knowledge he had passed into another person's hands and nervous system before he went. The boy had understood the weight of what Decker was carrying without being told about it, had heard it in the engine, had answered it with his father's tools and his father's knowledge and his father's voice installed in him so deep it had become his own. Decker reached into his vest, the roll of hundreds, $5,000. He held it out. His hand was not steady. Caden looked at the money, then at Decker. He did not reach for it yet. You owe me something else. Not aggressive, not triumphant. A fact stated the way facts are stated when the emphasis is already entirely built into the situation, and adding any more would only reduce it. Decker's jaw worked. The veins in his neck moved with his pulse. The entire chapter was watching him. 11 years of men who had followed him because his word had never broken, not for anyone, not once in 11 years. Every phone in the lot trained on him. The viewer count passed 12,000. He looked at the crowd, at his brothers, at Brick Sauer, who had looked up from the ground and was watching with an expression that contained no expectation of Decker finding a way out of this. He looked back at Caden. The word came out the way something comes out when it has been stored under pressure for longer than it should have been and the container finally gives. Not loud. Not the voice he'd used all evening, the voice built for 60 people in an asphalt parking lot. This was something from a different register, something private that had become necessary. Sorry. One word, low and rough like it had been worn that way by the distance it traveled to get out. He said it once. He did not repeat it. He did not qualify it or explain it or follow it with anything that might have changed its weight. He said it and let it stand. Nobody laughed. Not one person in 60. Not one voice in 12,000. Decker held the money out again. Caden took it. He didn't count it. He folded the roll without looking at it and put it in his back pocket. The same pocket as the emery cloth. The pocket where his father's habit lived. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the noise of the crowd was still going around them, but it had changed in character. It was no longer the noise of people watching something happen. It was the noise of people who have witnessed something and are still in the process of understanding what they witnessed and what it means that they were here for it. Brick Sauer walked toward his bike. He did not look at Caden as he passed. Not from cruelty this time. From something else, the specific discomfort of a man confronted with evidence of his own behavior who has not yet done the interior work required to know what to do about it. He would do it later. Not tonight, but later, which is when most of that work gets done. Decker turned and walked back toward his brothers. Nobody said anything as he joined them. Nobody made a joke. Nobody tried to reframe what had happened into something the group could be more comfortable with. Sometimes something happens that is simply what it is, and the only honest response available is silence, and everyone present understands this at the same time. Margaret Weld stepped forward. The crowd made room for her. Not because anyone was asked to, not because anyone decided to. They move the way people move when something has already been determined and they are only catching up to it. She stopped in front of Caden. She reached into the pocket of the Navy windbreaker and produced the business card. "My name is Margaret Weld," she said, loud enough for the people immediately around them to hear. 31 years as chief engineer in Harley-Davidson's powertrain division in Milwaukee. She let that settle. Let the people who understood what it meant receive it, and let the people who didn't wait for the ones who did. From the edge of the crowd, Mercer Bragg, who understood exactly what it meant, went very still. "What this young man did tonight," Margaret continued, and her voice had the specific quality of someone giving genuine testimony, rather than performing at 3 separate faults diagnosed by ear and repaired by hand in under 5 minutes, with tools that are older than he is something I have not witnessed once in 31 years. Not from anyone on my staff, not from anyone I have trained, not from any technician or engineer or specialist I have worked with in 3 decades. She extended the card. "This is the Harley-Davidson Advanced Apprenticeship Program, full scholarship, housing in Milwaukee provided for the duration, salary beginning on the first day. I am personally recommending you. Tonight." Caden looked at the card, looked at her face, looked at the card again. He took it. His hand was steady, steadier than Decker's had been. He held the card and looked at what was printed on it for a moment with an expression that was not what the crowd around him expected. Not amazement, not the visible relief of someone poor looking at a door opening. Something quieter than any of those things. The expression of someone receiving something they have been moving toward for a long time, who is not surprised it has arrived but is taking a moment to let the arrival be real. "Thank you, ma'am." 2 words, steady and genuine. Margaret looked at him for a moment with the same expression she'd had when she first recognized the angle of his wrist on the Craftsman, the look of someone who has spent a career knowing exactly what excellence looks like and is in the presence of it in the last place they expected to find it. "Whoever taught you," she said quietly, "for him alone built something that outlasted him. That's the best thing a teacher can do." Caden put the card in his back pocket. With the emery cloth. With the $5,000. Everything his father had given him, and everything tonight had given him all of it in the same pocket. The kid with the cracked phone screen had caught it all. The Harley-Davidson logo on the card. Margaret Weld's name in smaller text below the program name. Within the hour, that freeze frame would be shared across every platform the live stream had touched. Within 24 hours, the video would cross 1 million views. Within 48 hours, it would be at 3 million, and the headlines would arrive imprecise in their details, inaccurate in their essential claim, which was that something had happened in a parking lot on Michigan Avenue in Detroit on a Thursday night that people who hadn't been there could still feel when they watched the video of it. But all of that was later. None of it had happened yet. Right now, it was a Thursday evening in August, and Caden Ross was standing in the parking lot of the Iron Rail with his father's toolbox at his feet and a business card in his pocket, and the crowd still moving around him. 60 people redistributing themselves in the way crowds redistribute when the thing they gathered to watch has concluded, and they are processing what they saw and not quite ready to leave yet because leaving would make it over. Grandma Loretta called the next morning. Her neighbor's daughter had sent her a link at 6 in the morning, and Loretta had watched it twice before calling. He could hear in her voice the specific sound of a woman who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just felt it shift. Not disappear. Shift. Move to a different position where it pressed differently. She told him about Mercer Bragg first because that story had come through earliest. The 12-bay shop on Telegraph Road. The wall of certificates. The phone that started ringing the morning after the video with calls that were not new business, but the opposite of new business. 11 clients in the first week citing the same calculation: if a teenager with a flashlight and a strip of sandpaper could find what you couldn't find in 30 minutes with a $4,000 scanner, the math on paying for your services needed to be reconsidered. By the end of the month, his revenue had dropped 40%. He'd had to let 2 technicians go. The certificates on the wall were unchanged. The eyes reading them had changed. She told him about Slade Oren, about the specific moment in the live stream that had become the clip, the 10-second side-by-side that someone had cut together and posted independently. Slade's voice saying, "I checked that float twice," and then Caden pressing at 15 degrees off axis and the debris coming free in 2 seconds. That clip had its own life now separate from the full video. It lived on motorcycle forums and mechanic communities and in comment sections of every vintage Harley group on the internet. Two clubs had canceled maintenance contracts in the week after. A third had sent a letter that made its point without requiring many words. Slade would read Bulletin HD-78-041 in full for the first time in his career. The Friday after the video went up, sitting at his workbench with the attention he should have given it decades earlier, and then sit with it for a while before putting it somewhere he could find it. She told him about Whitmore Keach, how the laptop closing and the walk to the car had been cut into a clip of its own and laid against the 4 minutes and 51 seconds. His consulting website had gone dark within 72 hours. His social media shortly after. A former client had left a 1-star review that said only ask him about the shovelhead. Caden sat on the edge of his bed with the toolbox on the floor in front of him and the phone against his ear and listened to Loretta tell him all of this. And he felt something that was in the territory of satisfaction and vindication, but was also something else harder to name. The feeling of a person who has been told for long enough that they are nothing, that they have had to choose every single day to know that wasn't true, and who is now watching the world catch up to what they already knew. Not a large feeling. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't require expression to be real. He told Loretta he was okay. She said she knew that. She had always known that. She just wished Ray could see it. He said he knew. He said he did too. They stayed on the phone after that without much being said, because sometimes the staying is the point and the words are just the reason to stay. He used part of the $5,000 to settle the back taxes. He and Loretta worked out the calculation at the kitchen table with a notepad and a calculator and the county's paperwork. And when they had the number, he wrote a check at the county office on a Tuesday morning, and the man behind the counter processed it, and after some time, a different man came and removed the padlock from the door of the garage on Gratiot Avenue and drove away. Caden stood in front of the open door for a moment. The smell that came out was dust and old motor oil, and something underneath both of those that was just the building, the specific atmosphere of a space that has held a particular kind of work for a long time. It was different from what he remembered. 2 years of being closed had changed it. But underneath the difference, the fundamental thing was still there, the same way a face you haven't seen in 2 years is still the same face. He hung Ray's tools on the pegboard before he did anything else. Before sweeping. Before opening the window. The tools first, each one to its hook in the order Ray had established, because that was the right order. And the right order was not something he was going to change. The half-inch Craftsman with the chip on the jaw to the center hook where it had always been. He stood back and looked at the pegboard when it was done. Then he swept the floor, opened the single window above the workbench, let the afternoon light back in for the first time in 2 years. It came through the way it always had, at the angle that lit up the dust in the air and made the oil stains on the concrete look like something geological, which they were the accumulated record of every repair that had been done in this space over 20 years. He pulled the overturned bucket out from against the wall where it had been sitting and placed it in the middle of the floor. His father's bucket. Just a bucket the same way the toolbox was just a toolbox and the Craftsman was just a wrench. And also not just those things. Also every afternoon he had spent on it as a boy, and every lesson and every time Ray had put his hand over Caden's hand and slowed him down and said, "Listen before you touch." And every time Caden had learned what that meant by first doing it wrong, he sat down on it. 3 weeks after the video hit 2 million views on a Tuesday afternoon in September, when the light was doing what September light does in Detroit, coming in low and golden and making everything look like it's being lit for a photograph. Caden's phone rang with a number he didn't know. "Detroit area code," he answered. Silence on the other end. Not a bad connection. The silence of a man who has picked up the phone and is working out how to begin something he hasn't prepared for. Then, "This is Decker Holt." Caden leaned against the workbench and looked at the pegboard. Decker said Black Fury's running clean. No issues. Caden said, "Good." Another silence. Shorter. Decker said, "You available to work on bikes for the chapter? We'd pay, regular basis." Caden looked around the garage, at the open door and the afternoon light coming through it, at the pegboard and the tools in their places, at the oil stains in the concrete that went back 20 years and were now being joined by new ones from the first weeks of new work. He thought about what the call meant, not what it meant practically for the garage or for the chapter. What it meant as a statement about how certain kinds of men communicate the things they cannot say directly. Decker had said sorry once. He would not say it again. This was not an apology. This was something adjacent to one, expressed in the only language available to a man who had used his entire supply of the other kind in a parking lot on Michigan Avenue and had nothing left of it and was communicating now the only way he knew how. Caden said, "Why me?" He knew the answer. He wanted to hear it. Decker was quiet for a moment, long enough that the traffic in the background, wherever he was calling from, was audible as a presence. Then Black Fury doesn't let just anyone touch her. A pause. She let you. Caden looked at the craftsman on the center hook, at the chip on the jaw that Ray had gotten in 1987 when a bolt sheared on a seized engine and the wrench slipped. Ray had told that story often enough that Caden could see it happening, could see Ray's hand and the wrench and the bolt giving way. The chip was just the chip. It was also the story. It was also the 1987 morning and the seized engine and Ray's hands and everything those hands had built before and after, including whatever it was that now lived in Caden's hands and made them what they were. "You available?" Decker said. Caden looked at the garage door, at the light on the floor. "I'm available," he said. He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the garage for a moment with no particular purpose except to be there. The light was doing what September light does in a west-facing space, coming in low and finding the particles in the air and making them visible, making the air itself seem like it was made of something that could be touched. The oil stains in the concrete were old and new at once, the old ones from Ray's years pressed into the material permanently, and the new ones from the past weeks beginning their own geological record on top. The first customer was coming tomorrow morning. A man from 2 neighborhoods over with a 1969 Triumph Bonneville that had developed an intermittent miss at low RPM that 2 shops had not been able to locate. He had found Caden through the video, through the thread of attention the video had pulled through the world, and deposited at the feet of people with old motorcycles that needed someone who understood how to listen to them. Caden set his phone on the workbench. He picked up the half-inch Craftsman and set it back down on the bench, not because it needed to be moved, but because he wanted to feel the weight of it in his hand for a moment. The chip on the jaw under his thumb. The specific smoothness of the handle where Ray's grip had worn the surface over years until the handle remembered the hand. He sat back down on his father's bucket in the middle of the floor and closed his eyes and listened. Outside on Gratiot Avenue, a car went past with a rough idle. He tilted his head and followed the sound as it moved away. Heard the miss, heard which cylinder, heard the frequency of the problem, and filed it in the notebook he kept in his mind for engines he diagnosed without being asked, all the work he did in private that nobody paid for and nobody saw and that kept the ear where it needed to be. He would start keeping the written notebook again. The small one from his back pocket, dates and symptoms and diagnoses in his own handwriting. Ray had kept one too. There were 3 of them in the toolbox tucked against the back wall of the case. Caden hadn't read them yet. He would, when he was ready to hear his father's voice in that particular form, organized and methodical. The record of a mind that had worked the way his mind worked because one had built the other over 9 years of afternoons and evenings in a garage that smelled like oil and steel and something that didn't have a name but was unmistakably home. He sat on the bucket and listened to the garage settle into the September evening. Metal contracting as the temperature dropped. The workbench creaking slightly where the left leg had always been slightly uneven, and Ray had shimmed it with a folded piece of sheet metal that was still there, still doing its job across a gap of 2 years and everything that had happened in them. Wind through the window above the bench, the window that needed a new latch, but that was a job for another day when there were fewer things that needed doing first. He was 18 years old, and 3 weeks ago he had $11 in a splitting shoe and a library book with oil on the pages, and nowhere in particular to put any of what he knew. He had his father's tools and his father's bucket and his father's voice in his nervous system, where it had been installed so early and so thoroughly that it wasn't a voice anymore. It was the way his hands moved. It was the way his ears worked. It was his understanding of how the world was organized, which was that everything worth understanding was already speaking, and the question was always only whether you were quiet enough to hear it. He sat on the bucket in the middle of the floor of the garage on Gratiot Avenue with the tools on the pegboard above him and the afternoon light going gold and long through the window, and the first customer coming tomorrow, and the chapter calling for regular work, and a business card from Margaret Weld in his wallet. And he listened to everything the evening had to say. He heard the Buick 2 blocks over that needed its idle adjusted. He heard the diesel pickup at the far end of the street with the injector running lean on cylinder 4. He heard the old Pontiac idling in the alley behind the building with the timing just slightly retarded. Nothing serious. Something that could wait. Something that would announce itself more clearly in another few months and that he would hear when it did. He heard all of it. He opened his eyes. He looked at the pegboard, at the half-inch craftsman on the center hook, at the chip on the jaw. He reached out and took the wrench and held it for a moment in both hands, the way he had held it the morning after the funeral, when he sat on this same bucket and looked at the tools on the wall and tried to understand what his life was now that the center of it was gone. He had held it then and not known what to do next, and had started working anyway because there was nothing else to do that made as much sense as that. He set it back on the hook. Outside, the city was doing what Detroit does in September evenings, settling into itself, the day's heat releasing slowly into the cooling air, the light going horizontal and amber, the sounds of the neighborhood changing character as they changed in every neighborhood. When the working day ends and the evening begins, and people move from the things they have to do to the things they choose to do. Inside the garage on Graciot Avenue, Caden Ross sat on his father's bucket for a while longer and let the evening say what it had to say. Then he stood up, went to the workbench, and got back to work.